Good evening. I'm Mike Sprague, President of the Franklin School Board, and on behalf of the board, I'd like to welcome you to the 2024 annual meeting of the electors. While school boards are charged with the care, control, and management of the district, this meeting is for you, the electors. Tonight, you will hear the district's formal budget presentation. You'll be able to ask questions and make comments. You will be asked to vote on the tax levy. I'd like to begin by introducing my colleagues on the board. Dr. Angela Beer is the board vice president. Mrs. Debbie Larson is the board clerk. Mrs. Linda Witkowski, Mrs. Ann Sapersky, and Mrs. Mary Yank. Our board members, Dr. Maksud Khan is the board treasurer. He is not feeling well and not with us tonight. Also present are key members of the administrative team, Mrs. Annalee Bennon, district administrator, Mr. Andy Cromie, assistant superintendent of business and operations, Dr. Jessica Moe, assistant superintendent for continuous improvement, Mr. Leo Ekman, director of student services, Mrs. Amanda Pound, director of teaching and learning, Mrs. Laura Lancour, director of human resources. Can we have a roll call, please, Mrs. Larson?
Yes. Mrs. Sapersky?
Here.
Mrs. Witkowski?
Here.
Mrs. Yank?
Here.
Dr. Beer?
Here.
Mr. Sprague?
Here.
And Dr. Khan is excused.
Thank you, and this meeting has been properly posted. We begin tonight, as we do at all our meetings, with the Pledge of Allegiance. Would you please stand and join me? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. As we move to agenda item 3, we need a motion to appoint a chairperson for the meeting, which I'd be pleased to act as.
I move that we appoint Mr. Sprague as chair for the meeting. Second.
Motion was made by Dr. Beer, seconded by Mrs. Sapersky. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. At this time, I will appoint Mrs. Debbie Larson, clerk of the Franklin School Board, to serve as recording secretary of this meeting. For agenda item 4, Mrs. Larson would read the official notice of the annual meeting and the minutes of the 2023 annual meeting of the electors, both of which are published in tonight's handout over there on the table. However, at this time, do I have a motion to dispense with the reading of the minutes
So moved.
of notice to approve? Thank you.
Second.
All right, motion was made by Mrs. Sapersky, seconded by Mrs. Yank. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. I'd like to call your attention to agenda item number 5. The end of the year treasurer's report is included in tonight's budget presentation handout. I would also like to call your attention to the rules of procedure for the 2024 annual meeting. The rules may be found in your handout. Please note that the rules state that persons who wish to speak at the annual meeting shall be residents of the Franklin Public School District. Persons who wish to speak shall do so after recognition by the chair and must state their name and address. I now invite Mrs. Bennon to share the district administrator address, please.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here this evening. It's always a proud moment to share kind of a reflection of the last year and where we've gone. I put together a few slides this year to really highlight the work that we've done this past year that we're celebrating. Obviously, it's not all-inclusive as there's many great things that have gone on in the district this last year. But I think it's important to lead with these items because this is what the budget supports. And Mr. Cromie will walk us through the budget hearing portion after this. So as we're aware, we're a better place to learn, better place to work, part of a better community. So kind of reflected on what are the top 3 things we did in each of these areas this year as we reflect back on where were we putting all the operation pieces you're going to hear tonight. How were they feeding into the strategic work of the district? So we've spent a lot of time talking about the coherence plan. A big piece of the work of this year over the last 9-10 months in particular has been the development of the 2024-2027 coherence plan. Dr. Jessica Moe has been a huge leader in that and making sure that we had a lot of stakeholder involvement. We're pretty familiar with the new areas, but we are excited that we are looking at our service groups differently and how are we serving them and how are we bringing them to the forefront of our coherence plan as we continue our work from last year moving into this next year, along with looking at things like behavior, attendance, and some of our plans around our facilities and our technology. along with our self-funded insurance. There's a variety of stakeholder groups, like I mentioned, that have been a part of that work. Another area we're really proud of in our work as a part of a better community this year has been the Franklin Focal Point. This is a development that Chad Kafka, our communications specialist, has been a great partner in. It's an idea coming into the district I had, and we were excited to get it started last year. We just put out our third. It's at your seat this evening. It should hit mailboxes possibly today already. And what was really exciting when we did a survey for our Franklin Forward work this past April, we asked the community, so that went to everybody that lives in Franklin, what is the top ways that you're receiving information or you prefer to from the district? And that purple bar in the bottom at 68% is showing community that are not parents with children currently in the district. The blue is parents, community members that are parents currently. So this is the biggest way that especially our non-current parents with students in the district are receiving information about what's taking place. The third thing that I would say we're excited about is the long range, or we're celebrating, we're proud of, is the long range facility planning. So starting at this meeting last year, or at the board meeting at this time last year, we talked about the long range facility plan. We took a deeper dive into what our schools look like, ultimately leading to the survey that I referenced that we did with the community in April, which led to adjusted language and a referendum ask with the resolution that the board passed in June. So this was a variety of community engagement sessions, but the key communicator group is kind of a pride moment of the year prior that we started with, at that time, about 50 internal and external stakeholders. This year, we continued, we're up to 75 plus members, and they were an important sounding board also as we talked about the Franklin Forward work. And as we look at what makes us a better place to work, there's a variety of things, again, we could have reflected on. Just last week, we had our leadership summit, and prior to that, so that's about 100 plus staff members. Prior to that, we sent a survey and said, what are the things that stand out that made this a better place to work this past year? And outside of characteristics of listening and trust and authenticity, then we got to some pieces that are strategic work that we've done, and the biggest one was the Better Place to Work task force that looked at our compensation model, our PTO model, and we also looked at, or will be looking at, input on the district calendar as Laura gets that going moving into the next year, and catastrophic leave. So this team represented most of our work groups. We're working to build more in here. Custodial staff wasn't very well represented. We're going to add. And they really gave input, brought things back to the school to start to build that model. This is something that'll continue into the next school year. We'll continue to look at the compensation model and tweaks that may be needed, and also sharing information about health insurance, as that's something that every year, every school is looking at in business and what that looks like. Another area we celebrated and have pride in from this past year has been the second year of our, actually really the first year of school improvement teams that were revamped. So including stakeholders in the building that cover all grades and all departments. Prior to this past year, we had school improvement teams, but it was mostly the principal, the psych, and maybe the instructional coach, and maybe a teacher. So we heard a lot, or I heard a lot in my first year of we want more voice in how we're developing, what our goals are. And so this is how we answered, is putting together this team. We celebrated our second leadership summit last week with the group. About, I would say 80% of the SIT team members are the same, carrying through in that leadership. And there was a really exciting moment when they applauded and celebrated the new people that were added at some of our school teams. The words on the screen that we're seeing is also that same group surveyed before our summit last week, where what are the words or the traits that we look for in colleagues and leaders in the district? And these were the top 6 words. If it's bigger, collaboration and supportive, that means that multiple people wrote down those words. And the third area that has been celebrated, it's in the second year this last year, has been our Gear Up sessions. So more personalized professional development. So all of our staff spends time in continuous curriculum improvement. But then they also have, 2 hours of time each PD day. So last year, 5 PD days, where they can choose to develop and grow in any of those 4 areas that are on the screen. So it's directly aligned to the coherence plan and the school improvement plans, but it gives some choice to say, I know where I need to grow and develop and what will engage me to do that, and they sign up and attend those sessions. The gears represent just how all of our pieces are moving together, right? The district coherence plan is a bigger gear, moves a little slower to get it going, but then that builds into our school improvement plans, which builds into our classroom goals. Then we looked at, most important, how are we reaching our learners best, and how are we making sure that's all learners, and that we're continuing to grow. And we thought about 3 areas of pride we have in being a better place to learn. Each year that I've been here, we've been able to celebrate that we exceed expectations in all 7 of our schools. Obviously, our opportunity to grow is we'd love to significantly exceed by definition of the Department of Public Instruction, so we'll continue to work towards that. I think you see in the coherence plan, looking at our service groups and some of those other factors, attendance, behavior, those are pieces that when we do have more of a pinpointed focus and growth in those areas, we're going to see that translate over also to our school report card or accountability card. Another area that has been really large this last year, even leading into last year, is really looking at the science of reading. We've heard about it a lot, at a state and national level. But what that meant for us here was looking at where are we really strong in the classroom right now with English language arts and our writing, and where do we need to continue growing. So on the top right is letters. That's a level of training that our administration and our learning coaches engaged in, and some other staff members. You'll see Haggerty in the top left and Lexia in the bottom right. Those are both programs that were fully implemented this last year across the elementary school to really look at phonics, adapt to learner ability and where they are in their reading progress, and offer more flexibility in the classroom and data for teachers to reach students at their level and fill some of those gaps in learning, or stretch our students that are maybe exceeding where they currently are and that would be in the grade. And then in the bottom left is Savis. I always say it wrong, Savis. And we had our big training and kickoff this past Monday. This is adopted, as you know, in May. You saw a very highly engaged and excited staff that were asking for this to be approved. Thank you for approving it. They had just as much excitement, I think Amanda would tell you, this past Monday as they re-engaged with the resource and gearing up for the school year. And the final area that we'd say is a pride moment this past year in being a better place to learn has been looking at the profile of a grad. So thousands of people literally gave input into developing what are those more soft characteristics that it means to be a graduate of Franklin. This slide's kind of geared at our 912, but really profile of a grad, our next steps is stretching that into how do we build these skill sets and experiences in our earlier grades. And an example at the high school currently would be just our experiential learning. And we've seen the image on the left before, but we continue to grow the amount of opportunities for our learners, specifically at the high school, to engage in career options and experience and learning, and that gets them ready for the next stage in their life after they graduate as a Sabre. So that's a little bit of the highlights of the year. I think it's important to start there because it's what grounds us in what we do. We ended specifically with the learning aspect because that's the center of everything that we do. And as Andy talks about the budget hearing, we're obviously going to see the dollars that we spend, but I think it's important to be reminded of what those are doing and who they are bringing into our system to meet our learners' needs. And as we project forward into this next year, be better, be different, has been the motto that we started kicking off last week at the Leadership Summit, and just continuing to challenge ourselves to think about what are we doing a little different this year to meet our learners, to meet our staff, to meet our families, and to meet our community. Any questions?
Anybody have any questions for Mrs. Bennon? Thank you. Moment I'm going to ask for a motion to recess the annual meeting. But first wanted to, Mrs. Bennon was talking about community and building a better community. And I want to introduce John Nelson, Mayor of Franklin. We're trying to build a better community through a better relationship with the city. And I think it continues to get better. And I appreciate Mr. Nelson for coming tonight to talk about the schools and our continued dialogue with the city. So anyway, do I have a motion to recess the annual meeting for the 2024-25 school district budget hearings?
So moved.
Second.
Motion was made by Mrs. Larson, seconded by Mrs. Witkowski. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. I now invite Mr. Cromie to present the school district budget.
All right. Hey, thank you for being here tonight. Much appreciated.
We're gonna spend the vast majority of our time talking about the 24-25 budget. You will see some reference to 23-24 for comparison data, but again, we're really focused on actually the current year that we're in, but how does that progress throughout the season? So it's important to know our budget philosophy is student-centered. So we start with, how are we gonna educate kids? Kind of that 7:30 to 3:30 time slot for all students. We're trying to be as forward-thinking as possible. So in thinking about that and the stakeholder input, as you know, for 23-24, we provided all of our directors with a zero-based budget philosophy and to build their budget from the bottom up. Given that was our first go-around with it in 23-24, we put them right back to that same task. Build it from the bottom up and see where do we stand. We've talked about in the past, in our preliminary budget 2, about using some dollars as part of teaching and learning to kind of create that savings bank. So that's one of those kind of forward-thinking pieces. So in 6, 7, 8 years, when math comes up or language arts comes up, we're not looking at a $700,000, $800,000 bill that now we just have to incorporate into that year. And then, again, we want to be as fiscally responsible as we possibly can. People talk about Franklin, they talk about it being a very sound school district, and my intention is to keep us there as best we possibly can. We'll talk about the state budget. We're not in a biennium budget, but there are still some ramifications from the budget that was passed last summer. We'll give our revenue limit projection and effect on local property taxes, and we're gonna talk mostly about Fund 10 and Fund 27, our operating funds, today. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about all of our other funds, really specifically around rec and the tax levy. We're gonna talk about referendum success or debt defeasance. That's all part of our tax levy. Then the proposed entirety of it, we'll talk about the proposed mill rate, and we'll have some opportunity for community comment. The biennium budget that was passed last summer, summer of '23, included a $325 addition in each biennium year to the revenue limit. So that's partial state aid, that's partial property taxes, but $325 more per resident student. It did not provide any additional mental health, so last year we received about $31 for each resident child in mental health. That's remaining flat this particular year, so staying at the 31. Open enrollment in, our revenue, and open enrollment out, our expense, increased by $344 per student. So we are net positive, roughly 300 students coming in, so that's a great thing for us. But it does have an expense attached to that as well, an expense increase, I should say. Special education reimbursement went up to 33%. If it stays at 33%, it's estimated to be about an additional $190,000 or so. It's important to know that special education is called a sum certain. I think we talked about this last year. So the state allocates money in 2 ways. They have sum certain, which is a specific pot of money, and regardless of how many people qualified, it just gets divided up by how many people qualified, and it doesn't change. Oops, sorry about that. The sum sufficient, or sum certain, is that pot of money. Sum sufficient says, if more people need access to that money, we're gonna add more money to that pot. So everybody's pot is $1,000, saying it doesn't matter how many people apply. Special education is that some certain amount, so again, estimated to be 33%, probably not gonna be there. For 23-24, it's supposed to be 30% and paid out somewhere around 28. Our revenue limit, amount of money per resident pupil, you can see some history here. We start all the way back in 2010-11. You'll see that large dip in 2011-12, that's when Act 10 came, dropped about $550 across the state. That's when things like WRS came on board, where employees were now paying a portion of that. Health insurance really became a large topic in what portion of premium people pay. Over the course of time, it rose very slowly, and then in the last few years has picked up. So again, additional $325 per year. So for this year, we're gonna be at $12,137.85 per resident child on the revenue limit. What I've provided for you here is Milwaukee County School District comparison on the revenue limits per individual child. The average of all of those districts is $12,580, so we're just below it, $400 or so below. You'll see some different color coding than you've seen in years past. If you see a green bar, Those are school districts, Greendale, MPS, and South Milwaukee, that passed an operating referendum in April of 2024. So their ability to then raise their revenue limit per child, their dollar amount, has gone up. The school districts you see in yellow, which are Cudahy, Wauwatosa, West Allis, West Milwaukee, have approved going for an operating referendum this November. So an additional 3 districts asking to raise that dollar amount per pupil. So this is based off of 24-25. If those districts pass, we won't know what that effect is until the following year. Our comparison districts is a little bit different. So again, in the previous slide, we see Milwaukee County. So those are districts, bless you, that are adjacent to us. We share the same county border. Our comparable districts are based off of a set of 5 parameters. So a couple of them would be your free reduced population. School district size is going to be one. Minority number of minority demographics. But there's 5 total. This encompasses districts who share 3 or more of those indicators with us, and are also geographically appropriate as well. So you can see all of us, there's about 10 of us up there, are right about the same level in that dollar amount per child, per resident child. But it's still something we track, because these are, when we look at our peers, this is what we're looking at in terms of academic success, fiscal responsibility, things like that. Our Fund 10 revenues as projected, you're gonna see this bar graph. The first 4 colors only represent 4 revenue streams. The red is state general aid, part of the revenue limit. The orangish color is property taxes. Those represent 82.7% of our budget. That's based on resident pupil only. That light green bar is categorical aid, about $750 per resident child. And that kind of aqua bar that is encompassed by the 2 red arrows is open enrollment in. So 94.15% of our budget is really reliant on that third Friday count. So we've talked about that from a salary increase perspective, and how waiting till third Friday is so valuable. And to just show you here, 94% of our budget is encompassed in that one single count. That third Friday count tells us this. Now we have a pretty good idea of what it is, but things can change. So we want to be really transparent about that. The far blue right, that 5.85% represents everything else we do. So that would be all of our grants. So Title I, Title II, Title III. Interest earnings, which were really great last year. People going to events, Sabre Center, to the stadium. People renting our facilities, people using our fiber. Like that's all inclusive of everything inside of that. If we break it down and take a look at those in terms of dollar amounts, you can see property taxes in Fund 10 are set to go down about $752,000. We talked about this not when we first introduced the preliminary budget, but in July, when we had our state estimate at that time and how large our state estimate, our general aid came in to offset property taxes. So that's reflective here. You can see our state general aid went up significantly, $2.3 million, bless you, based off of that estimate. Categorical aid is down just a few pupils. Open enrollment is projected to go up 30 or so, and then others projected to go down. Now that other, again, that's all encompassing. The vast majority of this is ESSER. So we were trying to close out ESSER grant. We still have a few $100,000 being applied to the last order of our SAVIS, our English Language Arts, and then ESSER is entirely done. But ESSER last year was used to improve most of our SAVIS order and make sure we have Chromebooks. But it did not take anything away from operations, because what we took from the Chromebooks, we provided in a Fund 46 transfer for Luann to take a look at other technology purchases that are going to be needed and kind of help provide that savings account from a technology standpoint. So we're not reliant on ESSER in any fashion. This was a claim to mostly clear that out. If we take a look at our expenses, we're going to take a look at them in two different ways. One is how DPI requires us to present them. So we have an instruction component. There's a 6-digit function code. Anything that starts with a 1 is considered instruction. But the easiest way to think of instruction is somebody is standing in front of a child somewhere. That's the easiest way to think of that. Support services is about 30%. That's in that function code, that 6-digit code, it has to start with a 2. But support, not necessarily that they don't ever stand in front of children, but they're typically supporting the people that do stand in front of the children. So we think of our school counselors and school social workers, administration, whether that be district or building, things like that. And then we have some non-program costs. So non-program costs don't have a direct affiliation with a child specifically. Now, we're at 20%. The vast majority of our non-program costs are transferred to Fund 27. So that's the biggest portion of that. But you'll also, if you also recall, we talked probably 18 months ago about taking our capital improvements budget and transferring that to Fund 46 and then running that out of Fund 46. That'll fall on that non-program transaction. The 150 or so thousand going to teaching and learning into Fund 46 is gonna fall on that non-program transaction. So there are a handful of things that fall in there that do not necessarily go in front of a child or support that child. They support us as a district as a whole, but not necessarily child-specific. If we take, again, that same pot of money that you just saw and we take a look at how does it really break out, you can see 62.7% of that is salaries and benefits. That's across the board, though. That's instruction, that's administration. Open enrollment, 2.1%. Utilities is 2.2%. Interestingly enough, we are budgeting about $150,000 less than we did 3 years ago for utilities. And Andy Daniels and I are looking at an additional program that can help us even turn that down a little bit more. So we really focus on usage because it's really hard to mitigate cost. But if we can lower usage, typically that goes hand in hand. Although we have talked about those spike rates. So what we're really looking at now is a program to help us mitigate spike rates, which really set you for the entire month. So if we can mitigate that, then we can make some headway on utilities one more time. Transportation is about 3.4%. As you know, we signed a 5-year contract with Right Way. I don't want to say everything was 100% perfect, but it was certainly better than 22-23. And in talking with them over the summer, from an employment standpoint, they're doing even better than they were when they entered for us in 23-24. So I feel really confident moving into this year that we'll have as minimal hiccups as we'll have normal hiccups that come with busing. Our Fund 27 transfer is about 10% of our allocation from Fund 10. And then our department budgets, our building budgets, and a miscellaneous pot of about $200,000 falls into other, and that just means it doesn't fit any one of these categories specifically. When we take a look at our Fund 27 revenues, we really have 3 main pots of dollars. We have our Fund 10 transfer, which accounts for 65% of it. Our special education aid from the state is about 24.4% of our overall budget. Grants, our IDEA grant is specifically the largest piece of that at 9.6%, and other are just some miscellaneous revenues that come in through special education. We take a look at it in comparison to the previous year. Our fund transfer is a little bit larger. Again, we're still anticipating trying to be fully staffed. It's really hard when we talk educational assistance. So we've talked about that as long as I've been here now for 25 months. It's not any easier. We're still allocating as many as we possibly can, and we're still budgeting for as many as we possibly can throughout the year. So even come October 23rd or 24th, whenever we finally approve a budget, if we're not fully staffed, we're still going to budget for them and try to hire them throughout the year. You'll see state special education, as I mentioned, that's going up about $190,000. Grants, our IDEA grant is going down a little over $200,000. I think we talked in June, we have a gap in our English learners, which is requiring us to transfer some of our IDEA funds to cover English learners or really move it into Fund 10. And they fund that at 15% of your allocation. So roughly $219,000 is being allocated for or moved to CEIS for this upcoming year. And then other, again, those miscellaneous pieces are pretty close to where they were last year. Our expense breakdown, again, using the same DPI terminology, instruction as a person standing in front of kids. 67% Our services are 26.8, and our non-program transactions are 6.2. So non-program transaction in Fund 27 is typically a student who does not get educated on site here, and we work with another educational agency to help educate that child. Typically falls in that parameter there. And then if we break it down into salaries and benefits, you can see 85.5% of special ed is people. Whether teachers, educational assistants, social workers, school counselors, school psychologists, OTPT. Transportation about 3.4%, and 11.1% could be supplies, could be some work with CISA to help for training, things like that. I would say busing fuel as well. So we try to internally bus as many special education students as we can, and we pick them up on with other routes that we have to help minimize that. So a lot of that comes out of this particular pot of money. So some final thoughts on Fund 10 and Fund 27. At this point, we're still planning a 4.12% raise across the board to everybody. Now, we do know that we have our professional educator kind of plan in place. So that right now is still budgeted at 4.12%, although based on our current staff remaining is up around 4.66%. Every other employee group will remain at that 4.12%. We still have benefits for newly hired employees budgeted in here. So I currently budget all for family health and family dental. And I'll give you a breakdown of where I think that will fall after I talk about the total budget. And then we still have student counts, right? So school hasn't started, September 3rd. So we have a pretty good idea of who's all coming. Still want to get to September 3rd and see who actually comes. It's like an RSVP for a party. You put it out there, some people answer, some people don't, and then you see who shows up. When we take a look at all of our funds together, you can see Fund 10 is down slightly, but again, a lot of that is related to ESSER. We made sure we had that large SAVIS order. That was a great big component of that. Special education and projects, that's all of Fund 20. You'll see that that looks like it's going up $1.7 million. But $1.15 million of that is dedicated for the Community Education and Recreation Center because that falls under Fund 21. And then the remainder of that, about $500,000, is Fund 21. So those are clubs and activities that are fundraising. Money goes in, they spend that money going out. It technically falls under Fund 20, but is not related to special education. Our debt service amount, I have two numbers here for you to take a look at. The top number is if the referendum passes in November, you would see debt service expenses of $13.6 million. If the referendum doesn't pass, and I'll talk about the $7.35 million and where that all comes from as well. Capital projects are down slightly. Food service up a little bit, about $130,000. In community service, that increase is related directly to the Community Education Recreation Center construction. When we take a look at all funds together and we pull out the interfund transfer, you can see, again, we're about 12.68% over the previous year if the referendum passes. And we're about 5.19% over the previous year if it doesn't pass. But again, a good portion of that, $4.5 million, is directly related to the Community Education and Recreation Center. So if we pull that $4.5 million off of the middle column, because that's if the referendum does not pass, we'd be just slightly ahead of where we were from last year. I should add, one other point. When we take a look at our general education revenues to expenses, we're going to see today we're about $100,000 in the red. So our revenues do not quite meet the expenses where we are today. One of the major components, again, is that budgeting of everybody that's new at Family Health and Family Dental. So conservatively, I estimate about $217,000 will come back because not everybody's taking Family Health and Family Dental. If we're really aggressive, that's probably around $355,000. So really confident we're going to be in the black come October, and we'll find things to use dollars for. So I know Mary had asked a question previously this week about interest. So we earned $1.1 million of interest in 23-24. We're We're only budgeting about $650,000 of interest in 24-25. So part of that, and you've probably already heard talks, the Federal Reserve is gonna be dropping interest rates. That's gonna have a direct relation to the amount of money we're gonna earn. Now, I don't know how many times they're gonna drop in our 24-25 fiscal year. I would anticipate probably at least 2. So we certainly won't earn $1.1 million. But a crucial component of interest is it is one-time dollars, and it's not guaranteed to be next year. So for all we know, they could cut rates 10 times this year, and we actually earn less than $650,000. So if we think back to that Saberhead, that bottom portion, that fiscally responsible, is not having us rely on $1.1 million coming in interest every year, and being a little bit more reasonable with it. Now, that being said, we'll probably earn more than $650,000. So I can tell you one of the things we're currently looking at right now is a bus that has a wheelchair lift on it, because we do not have one. And there are times when we need a bus with a wheelchair on it. And so we're looking at that. So when we think about, well, if we earn more than $650,000 of interest and we're not earmarking it for anything specifically today, what are some things that we can purchase? Well, that bus is a one-time purchase. Now, it won't last us forever, but it's gonna last us for a long period of time. So those are the types of things we would look at. Or we're gonna go to Andy Daniels and say, hey, we earned an extra $200,000 this year. We project to earn that. What other projects can you sneak into your capital improvements projects and help start whittling that down? We know that's a really large number, but not everything is $1 million either. Some projects are $20,000. Can we get a whole bunch of those done? So those are the types of things we're gonna look at with the one-time dollars, is really one-time projects. Our proposed tax levy, again, we're waiting for 2 critical pieces of information. It's that third Friday count. September 15th is the third Friday. Takes us about 2 weeks to calculate that, and we'll have that done. And then that state general aid certification on October 15th. I just talked with several business managers today, and we are really hoping that the state was accurate on July 1st, because that was a nice welcome property tax relief for our school district in total. We're also today using a 5% equalized property valuation growth. We have trended significantly higher than that over the last several years. I would anticipate we'll beat that, but looking to be conservative with that as well. We'll get that on October 1st. So what we can see here, we have our 2 columns bolded on the left. So the far left column is if the referendum passes. The second bolded column would be if the referendum fails. Then you can see 23-24 actual, and the far right column is the percent difference for each of those. You'll notice in the referendum debt column, far right, there are 2 percentages there. Again, those correlate to referendum passing, referendum not passing. And then at the bottom, the total, again on the left, referendum passing, referendum not passing. In the proposed referendum fail, referendum debt, there is about a $3.4 million defeasance added in there as well. That $3.4 million, again, defeasing debt's good for us. It's saving us interest. Saved us about $4 million over the last 2 years. Was really targeting an estimated 1.5% property growth in Franklin just from new development. So you'll see that far right number at 1.49%. So using a defeasance, that gets us to about the new property value growth and leaves everything else about the same. That will translate to mill rate. You can see the total of 8.67 should the referendum pass, 7.67 for the referendum if it does not pass. Now that's $1 in between. Our referendum is going to account for about 82% of that. That additional drop is because the defeasance will be lower than last year. And then again, you can see the mill rate change if we take a look at it in total from year to year. So if the referendum passes, our mill rate would change by about 9.19%. If it does not pass and we use about a $3.4 million defeasance, we would see a mill rate drop of 3.4%. But again, that's using a pretty conservative 5% overall valuation growth, and then a targeted 1.5% of new growth, so new homes, whatever is coming in that wasn't here when we did the tax levy for 23-24. We can take a look at what does that look like on a median home value. So using Zillow's value, you can see the median home in Franklin's gone up roughly $24,000. So the mill rate of 8.67 should the referendum pass. It's about $3,550. If the referendum does not pass, $3,140. And you can see last year on the median home value is $3,064. So we're still pretty close to that target range that we're looking at, should the referendum pass. This is just taking a look at our mill rate history from 2014-15 to 23-24, so a 10-year history. You can see that we've gone down a little bit steeper than the state has overall over that 10-year period. And short of the referendum passing, we would project it to go down. But I think all of us here at the school level would say we hope that we can improve our educational experience for 4,600 kids that are going to pass through our high school over the course of the next 18 years. The last final piece that I wanted to provide you is a mill rate update from 23-24. So going back to Milwaukee County, our neighbors that we touch borders with. So you're going to see three different colors here. The blue, those are districts that aren't doing anything. You'll see a few districts in orange. That would be Cudahy, Wauwatosa, and West Allis, West Milwaukee. They have two referendum questions on the ballot in November. One is operating and one is capital. So capital does not affect our per student resident amount, but that operating dollars will. But if either of those pass, either will affect their mill rate, and certainly if both pass, it'll affect their mill rate. Green, again, has that operational referendum that passed in April. And then yellow, so Oak Creek, Franklin, and Whitnall have not an operating referendum, that should say a capital referendum on the ballot in November of this year, along with us, obviously, we have ours. But so you're going to see approximately 7 or 8 districts that potentially could have an increased mill rate next year from operational. Roughly 50% of Milwaukee County taking a look at some sort of referendum this coming fall. The county average overall currently is $8.03, so we're just under that amount. But again, that will probably shift significantly come when we take a look at this in next year at this time and taking a look at the 24-25 overall mill rates. All right. Any questions, comments, concerns? Go ahead, Linda.
I noticed you just stuck to Milwaukee County. What about Waukesha County? How would we compare in Waukesha County? We do border Waukesha County, and anybody can go there.
Yep, so I don't have that data here, but I can certainly get that. Mary, you had a question?
Oh, just super quick, the third Friday in September is actually the 20th? Does that make a difference?
Oh,
in
I don't know why I had, no, it does not.
Oh,
I don't know why I had
okay.
September 15th down then.
Okay.
My apologies on
The third Friday count is the average over 3 years, correct?
Yes, yep, so we average it over 3 years.
Isn't that 6?
3 years.
I'm sorry,
Go ahead, Mike.
Angie. Does anybody in the audience have questions? This is your time to ask questions about please state your name and address and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Jenny Brownson. I live across the street in the condos, 9448 West Loomis, the son of the high school. You mentioned that, Mr. Crow, I'm sorry, is that it?
Yep, correct.
That there is a 4.12 raise for teachers, for all teachers, is that the case?
So it's an aggregate amount of pot of money that isn't dispersed equally based on the compensation model that was approved this past summer.
Okay, so that won't be the case.
So not every staff member will get 4.12, but the pot of money is equivalent to that.
Okay, all right. Is there a surplus in the district?
There is, yes, we currently have a balance, a positive balance.
Okay, is there plans for that money?
So right now, that's helping us generate $1 million of operating income on a yearly basis. So we currently do not have a set use for that, other than helping us cash flow throughout the course of the year. So typically in any given year, we can get down to $7, $8, $9 million, and that's kind of the amount that we could spend without having to cash flow borrow.
And how does teacher turnover affect the budget for Franklin?
Well, we budget in lifetime for teacher turnover. So when teacher A leaves, Laura and I are already working on replacement for that and estimated replacement costs for that individual.
And is there a cost? Like, what would you say, what is the effect on the budget? Is it?
We don't estimate a specific amount per teacher that turns over. So we budget our brand new teacher weeks this week as a whole dollar amount, and really short of snacks and specific materials, there's not a dollar amount that goes to that. It's more of a time cost to work with those, or a mentor to work with our new teachers, for HR to process paperwork and things like that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? Please,
Sorry.
Mary.
I'm just curious about Nicolay and Glendale and Fox Point. You have the little, Mapledale, you have the little asterisks.
Yeah, great question. Glendale, River Hills, Mapledale, or Glendale, is it Glendale, River Hills? Mapledale, Indian Hill, are in Fox Point, J2, those are K-8 districts. So we're K-12, right? And Nicolay is a 9-12. So just as a note that we're not comparing necessarily apples to apples from a mill rate comparison, being a K-12 district versus the other types of districts. But they are Milwaukee County, so I want to make sure that they're present.
So those feed into Nicolay. Those elementary districts feed into Nicolay.
So it's a combination then of the four communities.
Well, they each get their own taxing entity. So Glendale, River Hills, and the communities that encompass that have a levy specifically for Glendale, River Hills, but Nicolay also has a portion of their levy attached to that as well. But it's not, I wouldn't say it's stacked on top of it and totally equivalent.
Angie, please.
Oh, I think you had another question. in the
Oh, I'm
crowd.
sorry.
I have a question, I have comments.
Please.
Debbie Davis, 9460 South 96th Street. I am a graduate of this great school district. So I'm concerned, because I think for, I don't know how many of the past years, there's been a double digit number of teachers, and they are a great asset. And if we want to be forward thinking and we want to see remain a sound district, then why are our teachers leaving? I know a lot of surrounding districts, they're offering their teachers cost of living increase across the board. And the base salaries are a bit higher from what I've heard in a lot of other districts. So I don't understand why we're not doing that. We have this surplus. I looked at the records for a number of years, that we can afford to pay our teachers more. So that is my concern. You know, I've heard that it's been this tradition for Franklin High School students when they graduate to go back and thank their elementary school teachers. We can't do that anymore because our teachers have left. And I also understand that, you know, we set up this, the district set up this, committee.
Better Place to Work Task Force?
And I understand that there was feedback on the salary schedule that was proposed, and very little of that feedback was incorporated into the proposal. And I think it's best practice to work with the teacher representations and teachers associations in creating these salary schedules, to do really good comparisons, to find a way to keep our teachers safe. So that's my comment. Another kind of side comment, not directly related to budget, but also another budget thing is, there is a price difference. When your older teachers leave and you hire new teachers, you are saving money, you know, because we get paid less. So shouldn't that money go back? That's just another source of money that could go back into teacher salaries and keep our teachers safe. And the other comment I want to make is I also think it's best practice to include parents in decisions where we can. I have friends in my neighborhood whose kids go to my alma mater, Country Vale, and there was a committee set up to interview the new principal a year, 2 years back, and they came up with a candidate they really liked, and their input was ignored. And the person that was hired didn't do well at the school, you know, left on maternity leave, and those parents are demoralized. So I think it's best practice to include teachers and their representation and include parents. And so
I'll make a comment to that, Mrs. Davis. I was at the new teacher day, yesterday to welcome people. And it was very nice to see, less people there than I've seen in the past couple of years. And a lot of people, a lot of teachers, of course, it's anecdotal, but I have heard a lot of teachers say, thank you for putting that task force together. The salary structure is a very good start to what is happening. But I think the proof is in the pudding that there were far less people at the new teacher day than there have been in the past, and I look forward to having that continue.
It is a 15% turnover this year.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Can you speak?
Laura will do a staffing report in October, I believe it's on the schedule, because then once the year's up and we have all the hiring done. But right now, as Mike said, our numbers are lower than last year. I don't remember the percent of last year off the top of my head.
Angie, please.
I was just wondering if you could comment on a couple of things for me. So going back chronologically, can you talk a bit about the relationship between our English language learner needs and the IDEA grant? I didn't quite understand how those two things were related.
So, as a part of federal identifications, if, I wanna try to put it in real simple terms. If you have, because it's very complicated, tons of formulas, it's exceedingly complicated. But if you have a certain demographic group that meets a cell size that has more than twice as likely of a risk ratio, they say, so more than twice as likely to be identified for special education, you have to take money out of IDEA and move it into not IDEA to prevent that from happening. So in our case, Hispanic students in Franklin are more than twice as likely to have the label of speech and language. So the state says we need to take some of that money out of special ed and put it into solving this discrepancy.
So basically that decrease then is reflected by an increase that's just dwarfed by the magnitude of the fund into which it's moved?
Correct.
Okay.
Did that make sense? How
To me, but are there any other questions? Okay. I
they
have a
direct
couple.
you to move money in a certain way.
Please, continue.
And then going back to the Fund 27 slide, there was, I would anticipate that the percent of money that came from the state would approximate the state aid amount. I guess the pie chart would be the most helpful number that you referenced earlier, which I believe you said would be like 27, 28%. Or am I reading, or am I interpreting the comment about what percent they reimburse incorrectly? Is it not of the total expenditure?
Correct. Yep,
Okay.
so they only reimburse 33% of what are called aid-eligible expenses.
Fine, that's all I need to know.
Yep, and so not everything in Fund 27 is considered aid-eligible.
I have two more.
Please.
Does anybody else want to go? Okay. Can you just comment on why our state general aid went up so much in that July estimate?
So the vast majority of it is related to a reduction in MPS,
Oh, that's right, okay.
related to kind of their
Right,
mishaps or
situation.
Issues.
Yep. And then my last question goes back to the initial bar graph comparison slide of the overall revenue limit across Milwaukee County. I have a hard time, can you just help me to understand why there is such a significant difference when so much of this number is statutorily controlled, from my understanding?
Yep, so this dates back to 1993.
Okay, so it's just how people acted in 1993.
So however you were spending then got frozen, and the increases have been the same for every district
Okay,
since then.
okay.
Minus the last few years where they've had a low revenue limit change.
That answers a question that's been hanging out there for me for a while. Thank you.
Yep, Linda.
Can you go to the rate chart?
Is this the one you want?
Not the bar chart. Comparison to other districts.
I think she wants
Oh,
the
sorry,
bar graph.
last one.
I mean, I think we have to be careful when we look at this, because to your point, the spending they're spending one thing, but their levy is more of a function of the aid formula also. And the rate relates to the levy. So some of this is dictated by how much more state revenue they got and not necessary decision-makings that occur. So I'm not real keen on the value of this. I just want to say that so we understand that it's a function of state doing stuff more so than, but because the levy, the expenditure really controls a lot.
I would agree. Certainly, some of the districts, depending on their socioeconomic status, will receive a greater portion of their state aid to offset property taxes.
And the fact that we have these operating revenues going on is because they're kind of caught in that revenue limit without any increase in the population. It's very difficult to manage. So again, this is very driven by the formula, not really decision-making at the local level. So I think we have to be careful how we look at this when we start thinking we're doing okay. Because that was probably a similar to you mentioned 10 years ago. It was probably very similar because it was all set in stone and we just marched forward incrementally.
That I can't speak to because property values would have grown at different rates inside of that as well. So that'll have an effect on the mill rate as well.
Correct, also. So I do have one other comment. You did mention the debt service. And again, we have, as you said, 3.9 million of defeasance in this budget, which is not required. We do not have to levy that money. And it could be saved and given back to the taxpayers. And I think we should consider doing that. So when you look at that 14.7% increase associated with the referendum, you're really kind of getting that number compared to a higher debt service number than we really need, because it includes 3.9 million of defeasance, which is not voter-approved debt. So I think it's probably higher than 14.7% impact. If you can compare what our debt service will be after the referendum versus what it is, which is a $4 million number, which was actually approved by the voters.
Well, I would just caution us because that debt is voter approved. The payment schedule is not approved by the voters, and defeasance is just modifying the payment schedule. But the debt is approved through the referendum.
But the payment schedule was not.
Payment schedule
And that is
isn't
what
part
we're
of the
levying
referendum
for.
question.
And that is what we're levying for in a manner that is more than we need to. It's not due at this time.
That is correct.
That's correct. 3.9 million. So I think we need to be eyes open when we do that. So,
Thank you.
Again, any other comments? I'm done with that.
Mary, please.
One quick question, does the district lose any money through students going to voucher schools?
About $1.364 million, you can see, is
Oh,
for
it's
private
right
school
up there.
vouchers.
Sorry.
Now,
Okay.
we lose state aid, for sure. But the state gives us an equal expense to that revenue. But I would say the state is laundering voucher money through public education by saying, we'll give you dollars, but we're just gonna pull that dollar back at the end of the year, instead of just paying the vouchers out directly. So that's how I equate it. So if voucher schools were being paid for separately, our tax levy would go down $1.364 million. Our amount of expenses would go down $1.364 million.
The levy would go down $1.4 million. I mean, that's real money.
If they pulled the state vouchers, yes. Yeah, 100%.
There was a question.
Mayor Nelson, you had a question. I don't think you have to tell us your address.
I have no problem with that. John Nelson, 7787 South North Cape Road. Just a couple comments. So, with Debbie, along with the high school and Countrydale. And I just want to say, first of all, Andy, excellent job. I mean, very, very well presented, very thorough. I mean, excellent. And I think you're going to be clearing up a lot of questions as we move forward. But I guess my point, and I'm going to be going out as much or as little as this board wishes in promotion of the referendum, because I realize one of the biggest probably the second biggest lure to come to this city and build a house, raise a family, is the quality of the schools. So, I mean, you're breaking it down. I've had an opportunity to see, where these costs are gonna go. And obviously, staff recruitment and staff retention is a big deal. And I think what you're putting forth is, to Mr. Sprague's point, that he saw less people at this year's new teacher, and that's a sign. That's a sign that that there's a success here, and that's how you measure that. So I just wanna say that I fully support this. I'm looking forward to the referendum and getting out there and helping get this point hammered home. And I think it's, I don't have any children in the school district, but I see the importance of the community of it in my entire life. So I just want to thank all of you for the work you're doing and this exceptional report.
Thank you. Anybody else have any questions or comments? All right, thank you. We will now adjourn the budget hearing and reconvene the annual meeting. For agenda item number 9, Mrs. Larson, do we need a motion and a
Yes.
vote, please?
Yes.
To reconvene or?
Reconvene.
We need a motion to
I
reconvene.
move that we reconvene the annual meeting.
Second.
Motion was made by Dr. Beer, seconded by Mrs. Sapersky. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. For agenda item number 9, do I have a motion to adopt the 2024-25 general fund tax levy in the amount of $25,165,864? Motion was made by Mary Karolewicz. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Dr. Beer. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve the 2024-25 school tax levy for debt service in the amount of $12,178,275?
Question,
Please.
why would we pick that amount and not the lower amount? I mean, there's no referendum that's passed.
Because we picked the higher amount is picked, because because it's the higher amount, and we don't wanna have to go lower. Now, the referendum will either be passed or not passed, so at that time, it will either change or won't change.
Why
By
wouldn't
statute.
you go the other way, go lower and then change it up? Because this is not, it's not approved. How can we be adopting a levy that's not approved by our voters, which is their legal right?
Thank you. Do I have a motion? Looking for a motion.
Sorry.
Sure. Do I have a motion to approve the 24?
Clarify the larger amount. I
The-
don't see it.
Do you want, I'm
want
sorry,
the
you're
dollar
asking what the
amount,
amount is?
Oh.
9B.
9B.
Yep, I believe it's 9B on the agenda.
9B on the agenda, and the amount is $12,178,275.
Which assumes that the referendum passes.
But is it fair to say that we will not be levying that amount if the referendum doesn't pass because we don't have approval?
Yes, I think we should ask our voters, we've asked our voters to vote in November, and I think they will be. I'm looking for a motion.
I would like to make a motion to approve it for the other amount.
I had a motion, I made the motion to approve the $12 million
Yes.
amount.
Motion is
we-
made by Mrs. Sapersky. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Yank. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
No,
Motion carries. Thank you. Do I have a motion to approve the 24-25 school tax levy for community education and recreation in the amount of $4,484,106?
So moved.
Second.
Motion was made by Mrs. Yank, seconded by Mrs. Sapersky. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
No.
Motion carries. Thank you. The electors at last year's annual meeting approved school board salaries in the amount of $4,000 annually per board member. Do I have a motion to approve school board salaries for the 24-25 school year?
So moved.
Second.
In the amount of $4,000. Thank you.
Yep. Motion was made by Dr. Beer, seconded by Mrs. Sapersky, unless it was the other way around.
No,
you
you
had
had
it
it
right.
correct.
All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Do I have a motion to schedule the 2025 annual meeting of the electors on Wednesday, August 13th, 2025 at 6 PM at the Education and Community Center?
So moved.
Second.
All right, motion was made by Mrs. Larson, seconded by Dr. Beer. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. Do I have a motion to adjourn the 2024 annual meeting of the electors of the Franklin Public School District?
So moved.
Second.
Motion was made by Mrs. Larson, seconded by Mrs. Witkowski. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you. We are adjourned. We will start the regular monthly meeting in a couple of minutes.